Okay, for people who are joining this live stream, we are talking about a somewhat complicated design issue about Wolfram Language. We have a variety of places where we are picking from a limited set of options, and we don't have a uniform way to do this. So, okay, so let's dig into what we're talking about here. So this came up. We have things like dollar font families. Okay, so dollar font families is a great big list of fonts, right? We similarly have dollar voice styles. Is that right? Yeah. Which is a list of potential voices to use for the speech synthesis. Right. We also have a list. So devices. If I say find, what do I say? I say find devices, I think, and it will go ahead and try and find devices on my computer system. Interesting. Okay, all kinds of random junk. Color schemes. How would I expose the color schemes we have? Roger or Brett, can you say something about that?
So color schemes is sort of a hierarchy. So there's the palette, and programmatically you would say color scheme or color data of gradient.
Okay, so color schemes has a palette right now, and then is Roger here, by the way?
No, I don't think so.
Was he supposed to be here? No. Okay. All right, so we've got a palette there, and you say, if I say color data, I also get a list there. Or if I say color data. So
there you get the top level list, and then within that.
Okay, so another thing we've got here in this list is example data. That's another place where we have sort of a pickable list of things. Okay.
And that's multi-level also.
Right. Musical instruments, how do we get that list?
We don't have a programmatic way of getting those yet.
Okay.
That's just in the documentation.
Okay, so now we've also got things like system modeler examples. I mean, I think that's some kind of weird gallery thing, right? Okay, so okay, so the question then is
the front end also has an undocumented way to reproduce a number of its menus that it populates. I can throw something in the chat as an example if that's useful.
Yep, please do.
And it returns as a list of rules for the particular example that I pasted. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but there are a few cases where it does, where the left-hand side of the rule might be different from the right-hand side for what you would want to, feed to a pop-up menu.
Okay, but so another thing is the styles list, front-end styles list, right? How do I get that?
I mean, the point is there are several things that the front end generates like this. In fact, dollar font families is initially sourced by the front end, but then we put a documented wrapper around it.
Okay, so another one is the current value settings, current value choices, right? The list of what current values there are.
Yeah, and that's not something that is probable at the moment.
Fair enough. But okay, so I mean, we have a whole bunch of these things. I mean, in the general case, we have like method option settings, all kinds of things like that. But the basic issue is okay, so interactively, we see autocompletion, for example. The somebody on the live stream is pointing out that color data has this nice choose color scheme thing. Yes, I agree. That's a good way to do it. Although apparently it has a bug, I'm being told here. Doesn't look obviously broken to me on the Mac, at least. Frame margin is transparent. I don't know quite what that means. In any case,
are you using a master branch build?
I am using the very old 11.3.
Okay.
If you try it again, I think you might see the dollar version stuff below it or through it.
Oh, that's absolutely crazy. That's funky.
Did we fix that? That seems familiar.
I think I had completely forgotten about it, but I don't know of it having been fixed.
Okay.
Okay. Well, something to fix.
Parth, can you make sure that's an open bug?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, how do I expose the list of styles in the front end from the front end?
Well, I mean, I just. You mean
that's it?
That's the list of styles that goes into the styles menu. There is no way to get a complete list of styles.
Okay.
And a complete list of styles would be quite overwhelming anyway.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. All right. Okay, so let's come back then to the question of how this stuff should work. So, for example, does example data autocomplete in the right way? No, that's pathetic. Well,
when you start typing, it does. Yeah.
But example data could perfectly well have a picker. So now, for example, this if I say sound note 0, 1, oh, okay, so that does have an autocomplete there. Okay. But it doesn't have the ability to say, so that gives you the interactive way to get these things with an autocomplete. But what we don't have is a way to expose that list for programmatic use.
Well, and it goes the other way too. I mean, there are people who would like to implement this functionality for their own functions so that they can get the autocompletes they want. And we have no documented way of doing that. And it can be done, but no documented way.
What have we done with autocompletion for user functions in general? Do we have a mechanism for that now?
No. Well, I mean, yes and no. Yes, we have some mechanisms whose design I'm not entirely proud of, but they're not documented.
That's the syntax information mechanism. Is that right?
No, this doesn't do autocompletion. Syntax information is about things like argument counts and that kind of thing. It has nothing to do with...
but is that user adjustable?
I believe so. To be perfectly honest, it's one of those things I haven't had a chance to sit down and play with in recent years.
Wow, it's been a decade.
I don't use the word years lightly.
Okay. Do we think that users are using this to set syntax information? Actually, good immediate question. This Parth could check into this with Brad Ashby. Are we using this in the function packlet business? Because we certainly could.
Okay, I'll ask him.
Okay. Also, I wonder whether this is in the guide pages about setting up functions and things. It should be. That's another thing to check into, Parth. But let's not get derailed on this right now. Okay. So, I mean, basically this is part of something like syntax information could be an autocomplete, a specification of how to autocomplete things, right?
Yes, possibly.
I mean, to be honest, this thing is a pre-association. This should really be an association.
Well, that's certainly true.
And given that it's an association, we could perfectly well add a bunch of things in there for autocompletion. I mean, we need autocompletion trees for these things, but which we have a way to define it. Okay, this is a separate thing. Who should be dealing with this syntax information thing to begin with?
Well, so we have a stake in it, but it can't just be us, though. I'm not sure who on the kernel side would be an appropriate person to be working on this, because frankly, I'm not sure what all issues come up, but it can't just be the front end team.
Why is there a kernel component that's significant here?
Well, I mean, among other things, this is a specification of the Wolfram language.
Yeah, no, I understand, but okay. So we need to branch off,
and we have to figure out, how this information gets communicated to the front end. There are lots of inefficient ways to communicate it to the front end, of course.
But whatever way it's communicated right now, I mean, is this actually being communicated right now, or is this No,
this is built. I mean, yes, it is possible to communicate this stuff, but it is possible, like a package loading time, to send a bunch of stuff like when you load the package, basically.
Okay. Well, so whatever mechanism exists for that could be used. Okay. Let's come back here. So this is one thing. But the other question is, what is the programmatic way to expose a list like this? So we've got a whole bunch of these things. Yeah.
And, the other thing to remember is that, there's a parameterization here. Sometimes, it may be the third argument of sound note, but maybe the third argument of sound note is exactly the same as the second argument of some other function,
Sure. Right. So, okay. So plot themes. Is there a way to programmatically get the list of plot themes?
There is an internal variable that contains them, although I don't know that it's really used for anything.
Right. Okay. But so what we're discovering here is there are lots of these cases where there's sort of so we need some mechanism, there are sort of associated lists of things that show up. Okay, so let's throw out some possible places this could go. Okay, so one somewhat bizarre place, but I don't think it's obviously crazy, is the data repository. Okay, so in other words...
I think that's instantly out of date.
What do you mean? I mean, it can always be updated. So, I mean, it could say resource data, musical instrument list. And that would then, we would document that, and that would then return the list.
How do you deal with versioning issues? Does the data repository have a mechanism for doing that?
It does, but it's not particularly exposed. It's intended to be a data for all time type of thing. But I mean, what's your point there? Your point is...
My point is, first of all, that there may be good reason to have these lists be different between one released version and another. And secondly, that we need the ability to do development in a way that doesn't break production.
Okay. Well, I mean, we could have a version, okay, if we're going to discuss this, we should get probably Brad Ashby here We can do that.
I'll look for them.
Thanks.
Right. I mean, the other thing is that many of these things are going to be user dependent, right? So what the list of styles is, or what the list of fonts is, or
I mean, actually,
okay,
the list of styles isn't just user dependent; it's notebook dependent.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So what about an alternative mechanism, something called like system data, that then has a bunch of string names? So, for example, you'd say system data. So then we document a large collection of these things. And each one, we could say system data of font families, system data of whatever. Thoughts about that?
I like that better.
There are still some things that don't really belong to the system. The style example being a case, but
well, it's sort of
but certainly font families belongs to the system in some sense.
Okay. But I mean, remember, system data. Well, what would you want to call it? I mean,
well, I don't know, but system data implies, that you can, that if you don't change the system, that you can evaluate it over and over again and get the same results. And for, in the styles example, that is most definitely not true.
Because it's notebook dependent.
Yes.
Okay, so, well, what would you then call it?
Well, I'm really good at criticisms.
I mean, this is not good. That would be like current value. Okay, so another possibility is to use the current value mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, in that particular, certainly for that particular case, and perhaps for others, current value makes a certain sort of sense.
It provides scoping and all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah.
Is there a current value for font families right now?
No, at least not that I can think of. The real problem with current value is that, like a few other functions, it's it's become. I mean, it's a bit of a dumping ground. I mean, there are some very well-defined things about current value, but then there are some things where it's just like, well, it's just a new string that behaves this way and a new string that behaves that way.
Well, I mean, yes. But I mean, so let's take a look at what current value currently has in it, so to speak. Is there a list of current values?
Well, there's a list in the help.
No, but what about, I mean, so current value...
No, you can't query it programmatically. No.
Right, so that would be
work.
I understand it's not going to work. I'm just making a note of it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at the help.
And there are, there are two very different uses of current value. I mean, one is for option-like things, and the other is for these, properties that that are not settable but are queryable.
Yeah, I mean, it is weird that some of these things are $sign accessible and some are not. Right. I mean, if I say, okay, so are they all capable of being made dynamic? Presumably
Yes.
they are.
Yes, every one of them.
I mean, it's a little weird that is that it just says shift key, not shift key pressed or something. Okay. Well, I agree that current value is a good place for some of these things. I mean, the font being used. I don't understand. What is font being used? How does it know what font is being used?
So this is, as Brett was implying, or saying directly, actually, this is where you can give it a scope. And so, I mean, if you don't say anymore, it will figure out the scope from where the current value is being evaluated. And if it's in a dynamic box, then it will look at the dynamic box's environment, for example. But you can give it other environments as well.
But it's totally weird.
Like a cell object, for example. Or,
okay, but there's no font family here. That's totally weird. I mean, it's giving you all this random stuff which depends on font family, but yet the font family itself is not there.
Well, that's because we don't list the options, and font family is an option.
To what?
It's a front-end option, and therefore it's readable and settable in the same way that any front-end option is through current value.
In that form? Oh my gosh.
Normally you would do it without the quotes. We alias it so it works okay with the quotes.
Humph. So wait a minute. So any option from the giant option inspector.
Yeah.
So if I went to line break within or something.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah, this is a really fundamental mechanism, and it's used in many places in user interface development.
What is a fundamental mechanism? The current value thing.
Yeah. The current values relationship to front end options. Okay.
But so the list of all font families is not available as a current value right now.
Not through a simple string query, no.
Although arguably it perfectly well could be, as this could be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the real question here is things that, okay, so let's take a look at what isn't. I mean, things like color schemes, it seems very weird to call those system data, and we already have this color data thing for them, although it's kind of a funky thing.
Yeah, well, in that case, it depends on what you mean by system. Do you mean the Wolfram Language system that you're running in which case it makes a lot of sense, or do you mean the operating system environment that you're and computing system environment that you're running on?
We've tended to mean the computer system.
Yeah, like system information. Yeah,
right.
But that having been said, system information actually returns information about both kinds of systems.
Yes, I understand. But so, I mean, arguably, system information should be able to be drilled down to find out things like the available voices that you have on your computer system. Because that varies with platform, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And it's not just by platform, but you might also be able to install extra voices depending on operating system support.
Okay. And clearly fonts can depend on lots of that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to come back to this again. Okay. Another thing that has been asked for here. So one thing is the programmatic discovery, basically, of these long lists. Another thing that's been asked for is some kind of filtering mechanism based on some kind of tags.
So presumably, for example, if you want to filter your font families based on whether the font is monospaced.
Yes.
As an example.
Yes. Right. So, I mean, one pattern we don't have is for each of these things, okay, so another mechanism we need is properties of choices. So in other words, e.g., get an association associated with a voice, font, etc. Now we have that for the voices, right? Shadi, is that correct?
Yes.
How do I get that, by the way?
If you have a prototype built, it's voice style data, bracket, bracket.
Okay. Okay. So that, let's just note that there.
And then, in fact, this voice style data has the mechanism to pick from the list. So you can say hash language equals English, and it just gives you English languages or voices.
So you're saying if I go in here and I say hash language equals Hindi.
Do something.
Okay. Okay, so that's a select on that. But so the general mechanism that we probably want is a way to associate. Okay, so given a font, we could imagine a similar association, right?
Yes.
Which, by the way, could have all of those properties that are in the current value documentation of X heights and all that kind of thing, descenders, all those sorts of things.
No, because some of that information is dependent on specific instantiations of the font.
Fair enough. And size even? Yeah, presumably on size.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there are some properties which are global. I mean, the monospacing being an example, and it's serifs and I forget the others, but there are a few others that we already keep track of.
Okay, fine. But so what we need then is a selector effectively for. Oh, I see. I mean, so okay, there are two things we need to be able to get. Given the voice, find its properties. Okay, so objectives, given a thing, e.g. voice, find its properties. And the second thing is filter on the list of all things, e.g. voices, for a certain select criterion, basically. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing is given a thing, find its properties. Now, how do we think we might do that? In any generality. I mean, in the case of current value, if we've got a bunch of strings that are fonts, how on earth would we specify to find their properties? Unless so another whole mechanism for all of this stuff is should we use entities? And when should we use entities? For example, should fonts be entities? If they were entities, then all of this stuff with properties, I mean, if we used entities, then that problem is solved. Then we take the entity, and we're doing, entity, property. We also can do things like, we would be able to do things like entity, font, and then, well, how would we do that? Is Alan here, by the way?
Yeah, I'm here.
How would we do?
You're trying to do a lookup?
Yeah, I'm trying to do a lookup. How do I do a lookup that says something is equal to something?
The something goes to something else. I mean, what are the?
Oh yeah, right. So sans serif. Yeah, that's exactly what we would need to do. And that would then give us the list of entities, font entities with them. So that's the next question: is could all of these things that we're talking about reasonably be considered to be entities? I mean, fonts presumably could be.
So these would be entities that we would have to construct on the fly, and they might not map to global entities, or they might map incorrectly to global entities. So these really would have to be private entities, I think. And I really haven't worked with those, so I don't know what the issues are.
Can you what do you mean constructed on the fly?
Well, okay, so first of all, you want the fonts that are available on this system.
Oh, sure.
And you may not have, just because you have a font with a given name doesn't mean that you have the same font with a given name that is in some global registry somewhere. You might have your own thing which has different properties, or you might have a font family that it doesn't exist in any global registry. So between those two issues, it seems like they really have to be private entities.
Right. So,
I mean, is all the information you would need to construct that set of entities exist in some programmatically retrievable form on the client?
Yes,
machine?
Exactly.
Okay, so I mean, then it wouldn't be that hard to have to generate a custom entity store from that data if we wanted that to exist.
I see what you're saying. So then I see it, and then register the entity store. Yeah, that's right.
Is there overhead in this process?
Yes, I mean some, not immense, but some. I mean,
the reason I ask is because you can't even count on the the list of font families being the same now and 60 seconds from now. I mean, it usually is, but it's not a requirement.
How would you detect that? How would you detect that?
Well, I mean, what we do right now is we do it the expensive way. We only make the request when you make the query. We have something that's more efficient that's inside the menus because we don't want to be rebuilding menus all the time, obviously. But in terms of what Dollar Font Families does, it just it does something that might be modestly expensive. But right now it's not that expensive because it's only getting names. It's not doing anything.
Right. So as Alan points out, entity store is a thing that we can, we have a whole mechanism for creating an entity store and registering it. Now, that registration doesn't, in terms of selecting a particular font. Yeah, I mean, we would presumably allow both the common name, which would be just the string name of the thing. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. For musical instruments, that's a pretty constant list. And we could perfectly well have an entity store for that. Now, unfortunately, the problem is there are actual musical instruments out there in the wild. Like, for example, control equals mandolin, for example, which is recorded as a musical instrument there and about which we have a bunch of properties, right? And I bet we do not correctly map those into MIDI instruments. Do you think we do?
Sorry, the question, do we have a mapping right now between instruments and MIDI codes? I don't think we have. Now I can't remember.
What the heck is that?
I don't know if that's a data issue or a data set issue.
That's a data set issue, I think.
Yeah, with intervals of quantities.
Yeah. Okay. Parth, can you pick that up?
I did.
Okay. Well, okay, so that doesn't contain the mapping. I mean, I don't know what the complete set of musical instruments is. We could presumably find out. And by the way, I mean, the fact that we have all of this apparatus for, okay, so we've got a bunch of stuff there that will definitely not be found in this default thing here.
Correct.
And we're going to need a mechanism to determine, let me just capture this point here. We're going to need a mechanism to, you know, these are specific MIDI renderable instruments. I mean, clearly this list is a list of MIDI instruments. Okay, Alan, do you have any thoughts here? I mean, gosh, you see, I mean, the entity mechanism is a good one for having an ability to list properties, having an ability to select things. As you say, you can build an entity store on the fly. That's all good. The disadvantage of that is, well, what is the disadvantage? So in this case here, we would end up with something like entity. We'd say something like entity. Well, we could say something like system voice, blah, blah, blah. And here we could potentially say entity system musical instrument. Making sense?
Yeah.
And even system font, or does that mean the wrong thing, John?
No, I would be comfortable with that.
Okay. So then the way one would do it, I mean, if one wanted to find out what are all the voices that are available, you would say entity list of system voice, which is not completely terrible by any means. And that gives you a bunch of entities. And then you query each entity, and we've got a well-defined mechanism for selecting ones that have certain properties. So that's all good. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other things here. So fonts, musical instruments, voices, they all seem to potentially work as entities. Do we agree?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite elegant to be able to do that with, you know, to have the fonts be entities. Is quite an elegant thing, actually, because, you know, we could even imagine doing some linguistics and things like that on that. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other things here. Okay, color schemes. Can color schemes be entities?
I don't see why not.
Okay, so that would be then system color schemes will be the name for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Alan, let's talk about your entity documentation stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be used to document these system entities? Seems like it could. And we just...
I don't know how that would... I guess so. You mean with the caveat that entity list of whatever this entity type is going to be different on everybody's individual computer.
That's what I'm saying, yes.
I guess so.
Okay, I think devices is not... Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, yeah, we choose pick some reasonably generic machine to run it on to generate the thing. And
yeah. Okay, I mean, I pretty much like the solution. I think devices is a different story and we shouldn't mess with that.
One thing that somebody else has pointed out to me on a side channel here. What happens when you want to use one of these system entities and you've got some code that includes one of those in a notebook and you want to share that with somebody else?
And they don't have it.
That person doesn't have the same set of system entities.
Well, what happens right now when okay, so that's another thing. Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute. So another issue is, okay, so system dependent is basically, what do we call it? The font substitutions business, for example. Substitutions for absent system entities, right? So John, you've got a mechanism for font substitutions, correct?
That's correct.
How does that work?
Well, first of all, it's recorded as a global option, or it might even work at the notebook level. I'd have to look that up. But in any case, so it can be configured by users, but typically it's configured at the it's the default configuration.
By the way, the autocomplete
Mac,
is
Windows,
not
Linux.
Covering the autocomplete for current value is not covering strings. The you know what I'm saying? Is not covering the
That's right, and I mean, like I said, we allow you to alias these things as strings, but the preferred way to work with them is symbols.
Then you know what I think? I think current value should have some kind of picker because it's got too many of these choices.
Well, but if you have some sense of which way you're going, then we're actually limiting the number of choices. I mean, if you're typing it without the string, we're not showing all the string selectors and vice versa. And you could argue whether or not that's a good idea, but it certainly does help to limit choices. If you type in font without the string, you're only getting options. You're not getting...
What? I never noticed this line here. I'd never noticed it. I mean, maybe we just make a table here. And I don't know whether the examples show this. No, they absolutely do not show this.
Look under scope.
Yeah, I'm sure scope does show it.
Yeah.
But I think you should show that more obviously right in the basic examples.
Yeah, I can do that. But people are not unaware of this. I mean, there are a lot of real users who are doing this, outside the company. So
all right, let's look at the substitutions. Okay. So where do these come from? And what happens to some random font on my system? If I say random sample, well, this isn't a good example because I have these.
Well, I mean, so in answer to where it comes from, the default value is literally a hard-coded list, which was created by design and R&D. Okay,
probably a long time ago by now.
It gets tweaked now and then. I think it last got tweaked, sometime in the last couple of years, I think.
Okay, so one possibility for this would be to store these in the data repository.
Store the substitutions?
Yeah, and where are we going to store them? Because there's got to be a big, these substitutions change with time. Ultimately,
version. I mean, so it's important. When we added fonts with version 11, we changed the table quite a bit. So it rely on the built-in fonts.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So we have certain built-in fonts. So the right-hand side of this is a built-in font. Is that true?
Not always, but if it's not, then it is, something which either has a decent chance of being present or it chains to another thing. So it is possible. You may not. Your first hit might not be present, but then it just substitutes again. And we do have these, they are different lists for the different platforms. And the reason for that is because, the different platforms have different expectations about what your default set of fonts is going to be.
By the way, Brett, why are these circles so damn big?
I don't know.
Perhaps you could check it.
I'll check with Charles.
But this is kind of interesting, actually. In fact, this is a pretty good example. In fact, we should definitely give this example when we have the page about font substitutions.
Can you stop scrolling for a moment so I grab a screenshot?
Yep.
Thank you. Got it.
It's kind of interesting, that particular thing. So this is telling us. Yeah. So the question is now, what do we want this to look like in the wild, so to speak? What do we want this to look like? Is this specific to my computer? No, it's a global list, right?
It's a global list, but it is specific to, this is the default list for Macintosh. It is going to be different under Windows and under Linux.
So as a hard-coded thing.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems like it will be useful.
And so you can see a good example of that right there in the small group on the right, where you have lots of things going to Menlo. Menlo is a font that every Macintosh has, but you will generally not find this font on Windows or Linux. And so on Windows, for example, the Consolus, which is on the outside right now, that'll get inverted and Consolus will be on the inside.
Okay. All right. So the same thing might be true for system voices, right? As for system fonts.
Correct.
So every one of these things needs a graph. Where are some other cases where we have such graphs? There's kind of a coercion graph it's like a type coercion graph.
Possibly musical instruments. For the long listed entity, musical instruments add to MIDI.
Well, I don't know. If you don't have a mandolin, use a violin. Pretty unconvincing to me. But yeah, there may be some that are sort of, fair enough.
But then even for voices, you could have some voices that doesn't map to anything. You have a Hindi on Mac. If there is no Hindi on Windows, there is no substitution.
What do you do for fonts? I mean, there's always a substitution for fonts. For dingbats, there might be no substitution.
So if there is no substitution that we provide and the font doesn't exist, then the font or then the system font chooser figures it out.
Okay. All right. So, how are we going to do this? Where are we going to put the substitution tables? So each category of entity, each entity type might have a substitution table. I don't think we have in an entity store any kind of global thing, right? In an entity store, so far as I know, everything that's there has to be tied to a particular entity or another. Is that true?
What do you mean? You mean that there's metadata about the type, or?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. There's metadata. In this case, there's a substitution table between the entities that says if somebody asks for this entity, the case that we're really concerned about is transportability. Transportability between systems. Either a particular platform doesn't have has stuff missing, or a particular user's machine has stuff missing, right? Those are the two cases.
Yeah. For the classes of things that we've talked about so far, yes.
Well, and how could that happen? I mean, it could happen. There could be a version skew problem, that some kind of color data thing isn't available. See, some of the stuff like color data, we can potentially patch it in. But for a font, you're kind of toast, right? There's no way we can give that to you, patch it into your system, correct or not correct?
We have no mechanism for that, no.
And fonts, frequently cost money and, not trivial money.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's not technically totally infeasible, but that technical feature might violate a license.
Okay. All right. Okay, fine. But so what do we do with this transportability thing? So you're on a system, you don't have that font, you got to default to something. Where do we keep this table? I think we're deciding right now that mostly we will have entity stores, which are entity things that will be in Packlets. They won't be in the data repository. That will be the way that we represent like fonts, for example. They will be entity stores that are constructed on the fly from tables or code in Packlets. But they also need substitution tables somewhere to deal with this. I mean, Alan, what's the analogy to this with our external reference? What are we calling this now? The external reference entities.
The external identifiers.
Right. So the point about an external identifier. Okay, so question for fonts. Is there a global registry of fonts in some sense? Is there a UUID for a font?
No.
So it's just its name, and do you have it or not on your system?
I mean, you could, collect some other properties about it.
Stephen, can you open an app on your Mac called Font Book? It should be there.
Haha, cool. Stephen writing regular. I wonder whether we ever used that. There. Huh. Can I run this? I'm now curious whether can I run this now? If the font is visible there, does that mean that I can say style? But now it doesn't autocomplete here.
No, it's font family. No. You can't just put a random string in, because what does that string mean? It has to be the right hand side of font family.
There it is at the bottom.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. I had no idea. Huh. Okay. It's pretty grainy. Is there a better way to do this, by the way? Oh, look at that exclam. That had to have a substitution.
Yeah, I'm sorry. A better way to do what?
Oh, just handwriting. I don't know. It might be useful one day.
Right. But so if you go back to Font Book, in the top left corner of that window, there is a little information button.
Yes.
And so that's, some of the information that the system knows about that font, the meta information.
I see. So this is the kind of thing which would be extractable for use in the association.
Yes. Try looking at a font other than yours.
You'll get a lot more stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. How do I look at a font on
there?
A lot more stuff.
Yeah. Maybe look at something like Arial. I don't know if that will have more.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. What do our own fonts, which, by the way, we should rename the Mathematica fonts?
Yeah, I know.
Where are they here?
Look under all fonts. Oh, no, I'm sorry. They're not here. They're not here because they're not globally installed into the system.
I see. Because that would be a nuisance to do.
Yes. And it causes problems with version skew as well. So
wait a minute. So that means if I copy something which is in one of our fonts into, let's say, Word.
No, it doesn't work that way.
Okay.
You cannot in our system, at least not without kind of deliberately trying to work around this. You cannot style something, or have a style that lives in our font in some way and then lose that information. It's just all Unicode characters, and then we're just.
I see.
Yeah,
we're just rendering those. But so if you take a differential D, for example, which I don't know whether that still lives in private Unicode space or whether that made.
Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. Yeah.
So then what happens when you go to copy that into something which doesn't have access to that, which doesn't have a rendering of that private Unicode?
So there isn't really any way you can do that. The closest variant of the question that you're asking is could I export it to, say, PDF or something like that? And in the case of PDF, we do actually embed the font, or rather a subset of the font that is relevant. But I mean, for text, for example, we're not going to copy that as the actual Unicode character because it wouldn't make sense to anyone else. So instead, we copy the long name. So you literally get / differential D bracket.
Okay. So I'm coming back now to this font substitution thing. Okay. So something has arrived. It's in, Stephen writing font. How do we do on the target machine? What do we do with that?
Well, so that's a font that we know nothing about. As far as rendering, it's just going to go to the system and do whatever thing the system font chooser is doing. As far as our queries of it, I mean, the only thing that we can say is that we know manifestly nothing about this.
No, I get that, but I'm saying, what even is the substitution? How does it know that this is a, if we know, okay. So you're saying
just do the experiment, so do the same thing with Brett writing instead of Stephen writing.
And you think it will think, but why don't you just give an error?
I bet you'll get, the default.
No, it's not going to give an error.
I see.
But if the metadata says it's the sans font, it'll replace with the system sans or serif, the system serif. So it'll get that close, right?
No.
Well, but it doesn't have any of that information.
No, there's nothing to work with. I mean, the front end tries various strategies.
Why is Stephen writing different than Brett writing as far as the exclam goes? I think that's a times exclam for Stephen.
It's because that's a property of the Stephen writing fonts.
Okay.
So in this case, the front end looked for any information from the system or from font substitutions. It completely failed, and it just said, okay, I'm just going to pass the string Brett writing to the operating system and let the operating system do whatever it will do.
It's a totally weird list of languages. It says style regular, which might be what it got the exclam from. Or does that just mean italic, bold, whatever?
Yeah, it's the weight and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's pretty random here.
My guess is that the exclam was probably plugged in as some kind of default thing from the fontifier program.
Yes. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so yet again, how sophisticated should we be in these substitutions for system entities? Maybe we should be as sophisticated as we can be and expect that it's hard code.
Well, I mean, what we're doing in practice, I think is very defensible. And if you find a way to translate that into, system entity queries, I would have no problem with that.
Right, except that we don't have a global thing with an entity store, right? We don't have global metadata for an entity store, which is what this would need.
Right.
I mean, potentially we could add that. A property of an entity type. Alan, I mean, that would be...
I've been trying to poke at this. I think that it may be possible to have some properties of types. I'm not sure how flexible those are. I'm waiting for a response from Tony.
Okay, fair enough. We should wrap this meeting. I think we've made good progress. Go ahead.
Let me just say that this just can't work for styles, though. I mean, it's the stuff we've been talking about. I think we can put together something coherent. For styles is a completely different category of thing. So just
yes, I'm not too concerned about that. I think that it's more okay. All right, I think we have to wrap this meeting. I think we have made progress. If we could, I know Alan is really busy right now. What's the right place to try to actually define this as entity stores? I mean, we should make sure that we don't have any other things that we're forgetting in this list. I mean, plot themes, things like that. Maybe we can do as an exercise, we can try and do musical instruments, plot themes, and fonts using this strategy. And see how that works. Yeah. So that's different people. Shadi could take the lead on musical instruments, Brett on plot themes, and somebody on fonts.
Well, that'd be in my group. Parth and I can figure out something.
Okay, well, let's try this. And maybe you can get Shadi can do voices as well.
So we want some sort of local entity store prototypey thing.
Yes, that's what we want. We want to see if this can work with a local entity store. Okay?
Okay.
And then we can simply use, the whole mechanism with data set and so on and so on and so on to get all the properties. And we've got everything there. All right, I need to run. This was useful, made progress. This is in Style Picker 1 in SW Notes in ILD. Can you get to it, Parth?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Talk to you all soon.
Talk to you later.
Thanks.
Bye.